Aventurine Waveflair is my most anticipated character since Finon, and that is saying a lot for anybody familiar with my channel. I skipped the entirety of Amphorius to E6 Finon, and I have done the exact same thing on Planarcadia, skipping every single new character released so far so that I can E6 Aventurine. So it goes without saying that I am very invested in Aventurine. I would never doom post this character out of hatred, and almost all of my testing has solely revolved around Aventurine. With all of that said, I have a lot of concerns in regards to Aventurine's current performance based on my testing, and I wanted to share some of my current findings and comparisons with you guys so we know where he's currently at. We will do this via the AshBlade Team Gauntlet that I have created as a fun little competition and game for Aventurine, but we'll get into that in a bit. Before we get into the discussion, I need to preface that discussing a character's flaws does not equate to doom posting. Despite some of the things I'm going to be saying in this video, I don't think anybody should panic or doom about Aventurine, because as a small little preview on what my conclusion is going to be, Aventurine's current performance is so bad that he is definitely going to get buffs. V1 Aventurine is not going to be V5 Aventurine unless Hoyo is quite literally sleeping on the job. So even though you are going to be hearing a lot of harsh things about Aventurine's current performance, don't worry about it too much. This character is not releasing in his current state, and none of this is going to matter in a few weeks. However, I do think it's still relevant to discuss the flaws of his V1 performance so that people are informed on how they should be evaluating his current performance and what sort of buffs or changes they should be asking for or looking for from future versions. So let's get into it. For starters, if you don't know how Aventurine's kit works, watch this video of mine for a simple summary. Basically, Aventurine is an Elation main DPS who can either be played with Elation teams or with follow-up attack teams, using ally attack frequency to speed up the AHA instant and launch his powerful Elation skill. Despite having two playstyles, Aventurine's follow-up attack playstyle as a solo Elation character fits him much more and is going to be the focus of this video. His Elation team playstyle mainly just seems to be there as a secondary option, and all of his Eidolons push him even further into wanting attack frequency, clearly pointing to the follow-up attack team being his intended team. The issue with this, of course, is that the current premier follow-up attack team of Ashvale and Mortanax-Blade, we'll just call this team AshBlade, has a lot of competition for the last slot on their team, assuming the sustain option is always either Hyacinth or Huohuo. Do note that Aventurine doesn't have to use both Ashvale and Blade for his team, since there are other synergistic supports, but we're going to start out talking about the AshBlade team, since that's the team a lot of people have their eyes on. Since the AshBlade team already performs so well with general supports filling out this last slot, like Tribi, or even working with other DPS units like Gilgamesh, Aventurine has to compete against a lot of different characters to earn his spot as the last slot on the AshBlade team. In order to illustrate how well he's faring in this competition as of his V1, I made a little game chart called the AshBlade Team Gauntlet. However, there were some issues with this initial version that I posted. I created this gauntlet based on the results of my own testing of the teams, but Blade's talents weren't leveled in the initial round of testing, which mainly skewed results against E2 Fei Xiao and Acheron. So I had to scrap this one altogether. Sorry to everyone who commented and voted based on the initial version. I fixed my testing, got more accurate results, and recreated the AshBlade Team Gauntlet to look like this. You'll notice that E0 Fei Xiao and Acheron finally made it onto the board instead of requiring their E2s, because lo and behold, having leveled traces on Blade is pretty important for their performance. Who would have guessed? The way this works is that Aventurine has to run the gauntlet, competing against each character on this board to see if he's an upgrade in the AshBlade team compared to them. If he is better than them, then he gets to move onto the next slot, and so on and so forth, until we discover at which exact point Aventurine stops being an upgrade. And that's how we will rate his value in this team relative to the other popular final options in the AshBlade team. So let's go through it, starting by introducing our competitors. First off, the initial team lineup includes E0S1 Ashvale, E0S0 Blade, and E0S0 Hyacinth, so a very low investment baseline AshBlade team. The comparisons between the last slot characters was done by testing the teams against multiple different matchups, prioritizing difficult high HP bosses such as the Graphia Anomaly King, the Ilbish Anomaly King, the Aquila Anomaly King, and so on. You'll see a lot of clears online giving Aventurine favorable matchups, like the upcoming Sam Memory of Chaos fight, so I wanted to test him in all sorts of favorable and unfavorable scenarios. The average result across all these different testing environments and how quickly each team was able to clear ended up being the deciding factor in where they placed on this gauntlet. Obviously, the slower clearing characters are at the start, and the faster clearing characters are at the end of the gauntlet as the final bosses for Aventurine to face. Most of the characters were given 2 cost, aka an investment of E0S1, or in Tribi's case, E1S0, to keep things consistent. Speaking of the gauntlet, we start with E0S1 Fei Xiao and Acheron, the oldest units on this list, and thus the weakest units when it comes to the last slot for AshBlade. It should be noted that Fei Xiao and Acheron could easily change places with each other, depending on matchup. Sometimes Fei Xiao is better, sometimes Acheron is better, just due to the nature of Fei Xiao being more single target focused, while Acheron is more AoE focused. After these two, there's Gilgamesh, who is pretty well known by now for synergy synergizing with the AshBlade duo, but is also well known for not being their perfect teammate by any means. As I stated earlier, E0S1, or in other words, 2 cost, is the standard investment level I use for these comparisons, and I kept it this way for Gilgamesh as well, because it's what most people are more likely to have. But since E0 Gilgamesh is free, and technically 0 cost right now, we will discuss E1 Gilgamesh, even though it isn't visually on this board, so don't worry about that. Additionally, for Gilgamesh specifically, Huohuo is better than Hyacinth, so he was given Huohuo as the sustain. After that, we have E1 Tribi, who needs no introduction as the current best teammate for the AshBlade duo. Hopefully I don't need to explain why we chose Tribi's E1 instead of her S1. Tribi's E1 is just very powerful. And lastly, there's the newly debuting Robin Samaretto. Robin will probably get her own video, but in short, this character is ridiculously strong, especially for teams that attack frequently, like follow-up attack teams. I kept Robin at E0 S0, so she is the only character without a second cost invested into her, just to show how powerful she is at a baseline. Due to this, she and Tribi were actually pretty neck and neck in a lot of matchups, but overall, I'd still give the edge to Robin, especially if I gave her equal investment to the E1 Tribi. Basically, I kept Robin at E0 S0 just so she could aura farm by being the final boss, while also having 1 less cost. But in reality, E1 Tribi was pretty competitive with her. So, with the full gauntlet introduced, let's pit Aventurine against each of them to see how far he can go. But first, type in the comments below how far you think he'll make it. Which character puts a stop to Aventurine's run in the gauntlet? I'll give you a second or two to write your thoughts. Or, you know, you could just pause the video. Alright, Fei Xiao and Acheron are up first. Aventurine is releasing a full 2 years after these characters, both of whom have not gotten a Nova Flare the way Firefly did. So if Aventurine were to lose to either of these two at just E0 S1, there would be big problems. That would be probably the most embarrassing outcome possible if he wasn't even able to make it past the first opponent on the AshBlade Team Gauntlet. And, well, there were some scenarios where it actually was pretty close. Too close for comfort for a 4.x character competing against 2.x characters. Acheron in particular was very competitive with Aventurine against Graphia specifically. However, since these tests were done against multiple different environments, just to deal with different types of mechanics, and to ensure no team was overperforming simply due to one single good matchup, Aventurine was still pulling ahead of both Fei Xiao and Acheron on average. Thank goodness. After that, we get to the halfway point in the gauntlet, Gilgamesh. And this is where things get a bit complicated. Aventurine and Gilgamesh are pretty neck and neck, which is very awkward considering the reason Gilgamesh gets a lot of hate is not because he is a bad character, but because he's supposed to be a very low value character, since he's mainly only for Saber, and he was supposed to be on the cusp of getting replaced on the AshBlade team, specifically by Aventurine. However, as of Aventurine's V1, I just don't think this is the case. Aventurine was able to outperform Gilgamesh against Quantum Weak enemies, but if the enemy is not Quantum Weak, then Gilgamesh actually pulled ahead in a lot of scenarios. And this is already only accounting for E0 S1 Gilgamesh, which you can get without investing any pulls in Gilgamesh specifically. Getting an E1 S1 Gilgamesh is technically the same amount of pulls as an E0 S1 Aventurine, and if we give Gilgamesh that much investment, then he just straight up blows Aventurine out of the water, even against enemies that are weak to Quantum. To be nice to Aventurine, I would say he makes it to the halfway point of the gauntlet still, where he ties with the E0 S1 Gilgamesh due to their advantages against different types of content and enemies, but needless to say, it is not a good look for Aventurine, especially considering E1 Gilgamesh just comfortably puts Aventurine out of a job. As for E1 Tribi and Robin, yeah, just forget about it. Aventurine is nowhere close to either of these two characters, and there were some scenarios where they were clearing a full 200 AV faster than Aventurine. 200 action value. That is an entire 2 cycles. That is how wide the gap can be between Aventurine and the actual characters that synergize with AshBlade. But unfortunately, the problems don't end there, because I actually made a second version of this gauntlet, one with slightly higher investment put into the AshBlade team. Mortonax Blade's E2 needs no introduction for how powerful it is. When it comes to building the AshBlade team core, Blade's E2 should always be one of the very first things you rush to pull for the team. Due to this, the second round of the gauntlet is the E2 Blade Gauntlet. Now, the starting lineup is E0 S1 Ashvale, E2 S0 Mortonax Blade, and still E0 S0 Hyacinth, with the exception of the Gilgamesh team, which used Huohuo instead. Before we even begin this gauntlet, we have to address the elephant in the room. Aventurine cannot make use of Blade's powerful E2. At least, not in the way every other character can. Since most of Aventurine's damage is elation damage, he cannot use damage percent at all. The elation damage formula just doesn't use damage percent in its formula when calculating calculating its damage. I've seen some people who think that making his damage count as follow-up attack damage would suddenly allow him to utilize the massive 75% damage bonus buff that Blade's powerful E2 is providing. But that, unfortunately, is not the case. No matter what they do with Aventurine's kit, even if they give him follow-up attacks, so long as the damage is still counted as elation-type damage, he will not be able to use damage percent buffs unless he also gets a way to convert damage percent into elation percent or something like that. Due to this, Blade's E2 is not buffing Aventurine's damage at all, not even by 1%. Now, granted, Blade's E2 still reduces his own follow-up charge requirement from 9 to 7, so his more frequent attacks do still give the E2 some value for Aventurine, but Aventurine is only using half of it, and thus, Blade's E2 mostly just ends up being a personal damage increase for Blade himself in Aventurine teams. Meanwhile, for pretty much every other character on this list, Blade's E2 is a massive damage buff for the team. Fei Xiao, Acheron, and Gilgamesh all heavily benefit from the E2's damage bonus, as well as converting their ultimates into follow-up attacks to benefit from AshBlade's full buffs. And Tribi and Robin don't care about their own personal damage very much, and instead just stack their buffs on top of the buffs from Blade's E2 to increase Ashvel and Blade's personal damage even more. When it comes to vertically investing in the AshBlade team, Aventurine is just the absolute worst option because he doesn't benefit from Blade's powerful E2 the same way other characters do. Not to mention Aventurine's own Eidolons are fairly underwhelming due to his inability to consistently stack his fervor stacks high enough to even make full use of his own Eidolons. Therefore, when we look at AshBlade teams that utilize Blade's E2, the nightmare scenario I described from earlier actually does come true. Aventurine doesn't even start the gauntlet. He goes to round 1 against Fei Xiao or Acheron, and both of them knock him out. Despite being 2 years old, both Fei Xiao and Acheron clear faster than Aventurine with Blade's E2, and you would rather just use one of your 2-year-old DPSs, even when they're only E0 S1, instead of pulling for E0 S1 Aventurine. If you don't have E2 Blade, you would rather just use your potential Aventurine pulls to go for E2 Blade instead, and the team will be stronger by keeping Fei Xiao or Acheron. Now, to be fair, it's not like Fei Xiao and Acheron are leagues above Aventurine. Even with the two of them getting the full benefit from E2 Blade, they are still showing their age by only barely beating Aventurine. But I mean, they're 2 years old with no Nova Flare. The fact that they're able to be better than Aventurine the more you vertically invest in the team is the literal worst case scenario for Aventurine. You could argue Aventurine could still have some value if it was only Tribi and Robin who he was losing to, since those supports could be required by other teams and thus won't be available for AshBlade. But the fact that Acheron and Fei Xiao, two main DPSs from 2 years ago, are also competing with him and capable of straight up kicking him off the team means Aventurine is literally homeless at the current moment. And it's a good thing I took E2 Acheron and Fei Xiao out of the gauntlet, otherwise they would bury him even further after I fixed my testing. Add on to that the fact that Gilgamesh is free and obviously also outperforming Aventurine due to benefiting from E2 Blade, even when Gilgamesh is only E0 S1 and doesn't even have his E1 yet, and Aventurine feels like a character released not even in 2.x, but arguably 1.x, when it comes to the amount of characters he's losing to in his supposed best team. Imagine if an E0 S1 Finon on release was losing to an E0 S1 Danhang Imbiber Lunai, who released 2 years before him, in the same teams. That would just be unthinkable, right? But it is the exact situation Aventurine finds himself in. Obviously, this isn't to say Aventurine teams struggle to clear content. He clears perfectly fine, but that is because the rest of his team is strong. So strong that they would technically rather ditch him for any other teammate, but strong enough to wheelchair him across the finish line if you really want to. Now, again, now that we've looked at the results, do not doom post Aventurine or panic about how weak he currently is. You genuinely don't have anything to worry about. After seeing these results, hopefully you understand why there is zero chance Aventurine releases in his current state. Aventurine at the end of his beta will very likely be a completely different character in terms of power level. So please do not take this video as a form of doom posting, and instead just view it as informing yourself of why Aventurine needs and will get many buffs over the next few weeks. There is no doubt that he will get perhaps the biggest buffs we've seen in a beta cycle since Silverwolf 999, who completely changed from an attack scaling character to a speed scaling character. I don't think they'll change Aventurine's scaling, but the amount of tweaking he'll get to his numbers will very likely be on a similar scale to the massive overhaul Silverwolf got in her V3 beta update. I'll have a video going into my exact thoughts on what needs to change and how they can fix Aventurine's kit, so keep an eye out for that. Before we end this depressing comparison video though, I just want to say that Aventurine does not need to use the AshBlade team. And no, I'm not talking about his underwhelming Elation team. While AshBlade themselves make good use out of Tribi and Robin as their final support slot, Aventurine can also make use of these two characters and kick out either both Ashvel and Blade, or just one of them. Now, I'm going to be honest, Aventurine's damage is in such a sad state right now that you sort of prefer Ashvel and Blade to just wheelchair him so that the team actually does damage, but technically you can run a team that focuses more on buffing Aventurine's damage with Tribi or Robin, replacing Ashvel or Blade or even both of them. And this can result in an alright team. I don't think it's necessarily better at the current moment, but if Aventurine Aventurine's kit gets buffed in a way that mainly just focuses on buffing his own personal damage without fixing any of his synergy with the AshBlade team, then I definitely think the Tribute and Robin variant of Aventurine's teams will be the one to get stronger. And this is partially because of just how powerful Robin's current kit is, so keep an eye out on that. We'll just have to see which direction Hoyo takes him in, and whether or not Robin remains at her current power level in future betas. Currently, the sad truth is that Aventurine is performing very poorly and is arguably one of the lowest value units in a long time due to being replaceable by DPSs who are 2 years old, a free DPS, or generalist supports who already have very high value for every account and outperform him by such a wide margin. Even Gilgamesh had more value than Aventurine due to actually being the uncontested best in slot for one team, which is the Saber team. Aventurine is just very homeless right now, especially the more you invest into your AshBlade team rather than investing into Aventurine himself, and he is definitely in desperate need of buffs. Buffs that he will definitely get, so don't panic or doom post too hard, and let's just wait for that V3 together. Trust me, pretty soon, this V1 Aventurine will just be nothing more than a bad dream, so I wouldn't make any pulling decisions based on his current state. So, as long as you aren't doom posting too heavily, and you understand that this video is just a small little check-in on his V1 to talk about why he needs buffs in his V3, please comment down below with your thoughts on what you'd like to see them change about Aventurine. I will definitely be doing another video putting Aventurine through the AshBlade team Gauntlet and comparing him to these other characters once he has gotten his buffs and becomes a real character. So consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on that. And like this video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. For now, thank you so much for watching. And with all of that said, until next time!